The Lutheran world is large, and today we get to learn more about the Lutheran world in Finland and in England. I first met Pastor Tapani Simojoki on Twitter, and we've been able to get to know each other a little bit through that medium. And it's been a joy. It's been a real pleasure for me, and I've learned a lot from him, and I think you might learn quite a bit from our interview today. So with that, let's dive right in with our interview with Pastor Tapani Simojoki. All right. Well, welcome, Pastor, to the Lutheran world. And we have not actually met before. We've interacted only via Twitter. Well, and a little bit, I guess, via mail with you sending a Bible for me. But it's wonderful to finally have a chance to talk with you face to face. Could you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background, who you are, how you came to be in ministry.
Gosh, that's a long story, but I'll try to keep it short. My name is Tapani Simojoki. I'm, as you can no doubt tell, my name is Finnish. I'm originally from Finland, and I was born and brought up there till my mid-teens. And then in my mid-teens, when I was in my mid-teens, my parents located to East Africa to be missionaries. My dad was a pastor. I was like, Paul says we shouldn't boast in ourselves, we should boast in the Lord. But I do like to tell people that there's been a pretty much unbroken line of pastors in my family since the late 1600s. And currently there's myself, my brother, and a couple of my cousins too, who are all pastors.
Wow.
That's something I can't take personal pride in, but something that is very important. But yeah, so in my mid-teens, we moved to East Africa, and I lived there on and off for 5 years, and then ended up coming to the UK to university, having been to the British-style schools in Kenya. And one thing led to another, came to university here as a result. Meant to stay for 3 years, fell for an English girl, and the rest is history. So I've been here since 1995, so that's a quarter of a century or more. So I've lived virtually all my adult life here. When I was a kid, I said there are two jobs I don't want to do. One is being a teacher, and the other one is being a pastor. I didn't like school, and I see what my dad's work was like, and I didn't want to do either of those. I want to be a musician. God spared me from being a mediocre musician. And so having graduated, I then ended up teaching for 7 years, religious studies in sort of various types of UK schools, private and public schools. And then after those 7 years, in the words of Dr. Tom Winger, president of the seminary in St. Catharines in Canada, who's a good friend, he said, quit playing Jonah. So I was pretty much, I went to seminary here in England, Westfield House in Cambridge. Yeah. I had done some study at that point already, some postgraduate study at Fort Wayne, Indiana, at Concordia Theological Seminary. And then I ended up here. So I was ordained eventually in 2010, and I've at Our Saviour Lutheran Church in Finland, and I'm still in my first call here.
Wow.
12 years.
Wow. Well, yeah, I am also a PK, and I did not want to be a pastor, and the Lord had other ideas. And so here I am. I understand and relate. Okay. Well, you have some interesting backgrounds that you can really help some of our folks to understand a little bit more about Lutheranism in a lot of other areas of the world. I am the ugly American. I just think about, what things going on in America. That's all I know about. It's really neat actually to have those interactions, because there's a lot more to the Lutheran world than just that which happens in the United States, of course. So maybe you could share with us a little bit about Lutheranism. Well, let's start with Finland.
Well, if you want the kind of up-to-date version, can I commend to you and to anybody who's watching a very recent video published by the International Lutheran Council. It was a live lecture on Saturday.
We had some members attending at that.
Oh, excellent! This is where the boasting comes in. The Bishop Pohjola, he's one of those cousins I mentioned earlier, he gives a quick update on what Lutheranism looks like in Finland now. Finland has been Lutheran since the Reformation. So the person who's often credited as being the reformer of Finland actually studied at Wittenberg, while Luther was still there. And Finland was part of the Swedish kingdom until 1809. So when Sweden became Lutheran de facto in about 1530, Finland, obviously as part of the same kingdom, did too. And Finland is a kind of it's an unusual sort of place historically and theologically, especially for, I think, for American ears, in that the Lutheranism in Finland has had this blend of pietism and confessionalism, which doesn't fit the kind of typical boxes that you come across in the Missouri Synod.
Yeah.
So just to give you an example, the Book of Concord was first translated into Finnish, which wasn't a literary language until really, except for the Bible and hymn books, until the 1800s. It was translated into Finnish in the mid 1800s, sponsored by the Pietists. And when the kind of church lawyers of the then state church wanted to dilute the confessional subscription in the 1850s when the church war, it was the Pietists who put a stop to it.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah, and so everybody has heard of and many have read The Hammer of God.
Oh yeah,
by Boget, and I mean he was a pietist, and all the main characters are pietists. But there are different, there are many kinds of pietists. So Finnish Lutheranism has this sort of, it has the problems of some of the problems of pietism but there are you occasionally hit this sweet spot, which is often missing, which is that pietism, which breeds this real kind of heartfelt devotion to the word and to a life of prayer, and to personal piety, which is completely focused still on the sacramental life of the church.
I think a little bit of that is being recovered in the church in the United States at this point, because I think there had been such an overemphasis on really pietism being just bad. I mean, that was quite frankly what it was spoken of as. And I think there's been kind of a recovery of the idea that actually being devoted to these things, being serious about these things, seeking to do good works, these are good things. And there's a huge emphasis on hymnody, hymn singing and prayer and so on. So this is a milieu in which I grew up. And it was very enriching. And I remember when I first kind of came across to the world of which the Missouri Synod is part of, and I, for the first few years, I found it incredibly arid. There's this sort of it was really unfair of me. I was young and judgmental, but as we can be.
But it felt like a Sunday Christian. People kind of the moment the organist stops playing on a Sunday morning, you start talking about football. I thought, what's going on in this kind of thing, which was I grew up in a very different environment. But there's something very rotten that in all continental European Lutheranism, which was, you can't blame the reformers for it, but it was really it goes all the way back to the Reformation, which was that pastors were trained at universities. Now, when universities were essentially products, designed to train people for law and theology, that's one thing. But of course, for me, so say 18th century onwards, universities became increasingly autonomous. You go to Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Germany, pastors are still being trained by universities, but the church has no control over what's taught.
Wow.
And that is my personal view as to why things have gone horribly wrong. So since the 1800s, late 1700s, rationalism, skepticism have basically been the main kind of mainstay of university theology, and that's where your pastors get educated. It's a pun in Finnish. I won't bother explaining the pun, but there's the essentially the meaning is that, we talked of a man who began in the spirit and ended up at the theology faculty. And it's a sad story. I mean, it's happened to several friends of mine. You go to university, come out a year later, and you no longer believe the Bible.
Yeah.
And so so these days, the majority of seminarians are female. So some of the bishops are. There are, it's not a whether, but when the church will begin blessing same-sex unions. Already some pastors do, and they don't tend to get disciplined, or if they do, it's very lightly done. The one mortal sin for which must not be committed, and for which you get defrocked, as Bishop Pohjola did. My father was defrocked. They were the first, since the 1600s, there have been pastors in the family. They were the first to be defrocked in the history of this family. Is disobedience to the bishops.
Oh, wow.
That's the situation. Finland is incredibly secular now. Like, church attendance is about 1%, maybe, out of, where 70% of the population roughly belongs to as are members of the church, but technically, church, and it's,
wow.
Yeah. So they pay their church taxes, and they're members, and they're entitled to marry, be baptized, married, and buried. But the old hatches, matches and dispatches. But so it's you will struggle to find anything, and you will struggle to find congregations where the gospel is still being purely preached at all, because it's impossible to get an appointment in a parish unless you first officially express your support for women's ordination.
Wow.
So and you can't get ordained if you oppose it, which is why the mission diocese, Evangelical Lutheran mission diocese, came to be, gone from 0 to about 45 congregations in 20 years, and it's growing. And that's where there are some still movements within the state church, these pietistic movements that are still kind of holding on. But my judgment is that their future is very much uncertain. The mission diocese, I think, is currently the future of confessional Lutheranism in Finland. There are some small independent churches, some of which used to be in fellowship with the Missouri Synod, but they're very, very small.
Yeah, and the confessional diocese then is not state supported, correct? That's
it's entirely independent. Yeah.
Okay, and so to have people in Finland value the church and establish these congregations, that comes at great cost to them, doesn't it?
It's been a tremendous cultural shift. Especially, my father died recently. My mother is still alive, and for her generation, it's, to go from a place where the majority church is still faithful with problems to this situation is unimaginable. It's I still, whenever I read The Hammer of God, where the last novel was set in the late 30s, early 40s, and it's like, this is the church in which I grew up.
Yeah, and
it doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. My children have never encountered it. But also that where you go from, the kind of funding model where the state takes X percentage of your income, and the church is there.
Yeah.
At one point I read that the church employs so many people, and 1 in 10 is a pastor, because they can afford to employ gardeners and caretakers and social workers and deaconesses and deacons and youth workers and children's workers and all sorts, But as the membership plummets, of course, the income will plummet too, and at some point that will. If you've got 120,000 members in a parish, which some of them do, and 200 go to church, at some point you're going to have to. It's going to get tough. But yeah, so it has been very difficult, and teaching the people to see members, your membership of the congregation being directly responsible for the maintenance of the congregation. That's been has been and continues to be a kind of very important lesson, because it's not been the case ever.
I can understand how that would be very challenging, because you go from things just happen because the taxes are taking care of that, to now we have to make those things happen. And it's easy enough to understand it maybe in your mind, but it's a whole nother thing to entirely be immersed in that and to live that out. That would be challenging.
Yeah, and it has been. It's such a wrench, because these are essentially people have been evicted from their home and somebody else has occupied it. somebody squatting in their kind of church home, and now said, now we have to start paying rent for this place that wasn't ours in the first place. That's the kind of scenario. But it's been a great, tremendous blessing, because it has focused, it's forced those congregations, those people to focus. What does it mean to be a church? What does it mean to be a Lutheran? What does it mean to be a member of a church? And why do we bother? And what does it take? And I think I personally think it's far healthier. One of the first bishop of the mission diocese, recently retired, Bishop Aristos Soramias, he once referred to this kind of easy automatic money as sweet poison. And I think it's absolutely right. And it's not just tax money, but any kind of subsidy. You get subsidy. I mean, my current church, we have had those problems in the past, not from tax, but from overseas subsidy, and it can really undermine a church in the long run.
Yeah. I've got friends that serve in mission settings, and it's a tricky situation, because you need sometimes help from the outside, but boy, that can be so dangerous.
It can, yeah. I think the shorter the distance between the preacher's mouth and the congregant's pocket, the better.
Yeah,
basically, that's my take.
I think it's interesting too, the idea of sacrifice. That when there is sacrifice that's involved in living out the faith, it's actually quite healthy. It's not pleasant, but it's quite healthy, because there is a cost in following Christ.
Yeah. When people ask me, we just had 3 new members join us yesterday, which is fantastic. And people always ask me, they ask me about giving, and if they come from another Christian tradition, say, should we, do you insist on tithing? And so we don't insist on anything, but you should give. And some people should give more, and some people should give less than 10%. And some people should be net recipients of the church's charity. But I say, no, your giving should be such that it forces you to think about your money.
Yeah.
So it forces you to make choices, so that it not because God needs you to, but because it helps you to have that focus all the time. Say, what is it that I am prioritizing? I think there's an apocryphal saying, which I've heard attributed to Helmut Thielicke, the German theologian, who said that if I want to know the state of a man's soul, I don't look at his prayer book, I just examine his checkbook. And I think there's some truth in that.
Yeah. People, I think people are more, they would rather you preach harshly against their heart than against their pocketbook.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so now you've been in England for quite some time, and the situation for Lutheranism in England is quite a different story, isn't it? The history of it.
It is. I mean, first thing I think you should know is that the size of the Lutheran Church in the UK falls very comfortably inside any statistical margin of error about we are
that large, huh?
In so we are. I'm a pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of England, which is the older of the two, if you like, sort of indigenous churches. There are some overseas churches that have outposts here, Swedish, Finnish, German churches that have kind of congregations here for express, but for the kind of churches that are part of this country, we are the larger of the two, and we have fewer than 1,000 members nationally.
Wow.
In a population of 63 million.
Wow.
Or 6, whatever it is. The other church is smaller. So we are absolutely tiny. The history is very interesting, because it kind of actually touches on what we just talked about. There has been there's been Lutheranism here in this country since the Reformation. The early stages of the English Reformation were Lutheran. So the earliest reformers were very much influenced by Lutheranism, and some of your viewers may know that the one of the titles of the monarch of the United Kingdom is Defender of Faith, and that title was given to Henry VIII for his refutation of Martin Luther's Babylonian captivity of the Church, which is why I'm not particularly keen on it myself, but as a title. But that was, Luther was read here, smuggled in here in the 1520s and 30s, and but for various reasons, which you can go and read about in a book somewhere, the Reformed Christianity in this country ended up not being Lutheran, and it became established. And for a long time, there was very little flexibility about it. However, foreign communities, and particularly foreign embassies, were permitted to worship in a kind of native style. So the Swedish embassy, various German embassies had chaplains, as long as they didn't worship in English. You weren't allowed to worship Lutheran-wise in English, but you could in Swedish or in German. And then when the Hanoverians became kings, George first, second, and third, and so on, there was for a time there was a Lutheran chaplain at the court because they were kings they were sort of princes of Hanover in Germany as well. But there were no native English language Lutherans here at all. 1894, fast forward, or early 1890s, half a dozen German master bakers, young German master bakers, decided to come and emigrate to London and try their luck at baking bread for the English. They go to the German church in London and decide very quickly, whatever this is German, yes, but it certainly isn't Lutheran in a confessional sense. This is not good enough. And so they wrote to St. Louis and said, could you send us a bilingual pastor, please? And they committed, and this is where we connect to the earlier conversation, they made a written commitment that one shilling in six that they earned, they would dedicate to employing this pastor.
Wow.
And so the Missouri Synod sent a pastor over in 1894, and Emmanuel Lutheran Church was born in North London in Kentish Town. Still going. He changed his name in the 1930s to Luther Tyndale Memorial Church, kind of to say the faith of Luther in the language of Tyndale. So Luther Tyndale Memorial Church is our mother church, if you like. And essentially, and then in 1903, a second congregation slightly further north in Tottenham, so northeast of Kentish Town, was also founded. So the two Trinity Lutheran Church, and they became part of the Atlantic District of the Missouri Synod. So depending how you count, you could say at one time Atlantic District of Missouri Synod was very, very big.
Yes.
Stretched all across the Atlantic, nothing in the middle, but they were part of it. In the late 1940s, after the war, or was it early 50s, can't remember now, late 40s, a Canadian pastor, because Canada, of course, was part of the Missouri Synod as well, was called to be a pastor of Luther Tyndale. And he had this real vision of establishing the Lutheran Church not just as an enclave for Germans and Americans in London, but really that this country in the post-war big upheaval, lots of population movements, new towns being built, and so on, lots of new housing, and the Church of England can't look after them all. Lots of people. No, this is the moment. This is the moment, and he persuaded the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod over the decades to sending millions this way. And over the next 30 years or so, lots of congregations, upwards of 20 congregations were planted.
Wow.
And they looked wherever there was a new town or some massive housing project next to a city or a town that was kind of essentially a whole new community. They would go and persuade the local council, so that, could you give us a piece of land and we'll build a church in it and we'll call it a community building. You can use it as a polling booth and for child group, whatever, toddler groups and so on. And so they did, and so built all these places. Unfortunately, they used the same architect who built some pretty unsustainable buildings. So a lot of them have been demolished already, including the one here. But that's how the church grew. Now, as it turned out, to everyone's surprise, Britain is not America.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, two nations separated by common languages, as Churchill put it. But so it's a very different culture, and I think they were over optimistic about how things would take off. And at that point, Christianity was in serious decline.
Yeah, and it's interesting because at that point in the United States, it's booming because you have that post-war boom, and they're just building churches, and everywhere they build a church, the church grows, and it really did lead to kind of an arrogance, I think, an unrealistic expectation that if we just build a building, plant a church here, it will grow, and it's just going to happen.
Yeah, and I've seen some of the paperwork from the 50s. They had this thing called the Master Plan Committee, and they worked really hard, and they did all kinds of good things. But they said, after so many years, the church will have grown this much, and we will become financially sustainable by such and such a time. Never happened. It never happened. And so when eventually about 1990-ish, the Missouri Synod said, we've been pouring money into this church for a long time for not that much to show for it, and they began to turn that stream off. We found ourselves in quite a tight spot, and we've lost a lot of congregations since then. There have been all sorts of other things too, but there's a whole thing of it being a new thing. So for a lot of our Lutherans, our first generation Lutherans, my congregation, most of the members are older members who had never heard of Lutheranism until this church was built, and then they became Lutherans. And we are below critical mass, and we are very thinly scattered across the country. So, my daughter's just gone off to university, and at my encouragement, she decided to look for a university place only somewhere where she could go to a Lutheran church.
Right, and that's good wisdom there. I encourage all of our college
that leaves
students.
That leaves you fewer than 10 to choose from.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, as it happens, she's a bright button, and she got into a good university where there happens to be a good, faithful Lutheran congregation pastored by a man you know very well. But it's not the same for it's not a foregone conclusion. Do you take this job? You want to take a job near a Lutheran church? The market gets very, very small indeed, and so we keep bleeding the next generation. And it's very difficult to. So because people, the elderly generation in this country are still, generally speaking, fairly geographically stable. They stay put. Young people don't. They move around. They leave home. And where I live, for example, there's nothing here for young people. It's a pleasant place to bring up a family, but unless you want to work in one of the jobs that are on offer here, this is not a happening place.
Right. Yeah. That's typical for a lot of congregations in the United States. The country parishes.
And so we keep bleeding out.
They go once a student goes away to college, the likelihood of them returning, it's not very likely. And so I think it's an important thing for us to help teach that next generation. Okay, when you do go away, what are you looking for? Are you prioritizing the things of God, or are you only thinking in terms of job and career and education? Because it's easy.
So my line to
go ahead.
Sorry, my line to both old and young members, and particularly young people, because I'm quite heavily involved in our sort of national youth work, is to say, when you are going to university or college, or when you're looking for a job, don't first get a job or a place and then start looking for a church. By then it's too late, because if there isn't one, that's it.
Yep.
And you say, and we haven't got young people in our church, not very many, but if you go, we'll have fewer. And then we won't have young people. Whereas if you stay and you suffer the loneliness and then have children and bring them up here, there's at least a possibility of a future. Whereas this way, we just keep constantly, filtering out the best of our youth, and they never come back, because then they either walk away, they kind of dry, their faith dies because they don't go to church at all, or it becomes a thing you do when you go visit mum and dad. Or you join another, a more, another denomination that happens to be easy to find, and any of those options, and people don't come back. And
so we're back to the idea of sacrifice being necessary for the sake of the church.
What's the number one priority? That's the question. What's the most important?
Right. Yeah.
And it's not. It's hard. It's really hard. Very, very hard. It's hard in Europe, because Europe is the lights are, God's turning the lights off quite fast in this part of the world. I mean, the lampstand's been moved, and it's the darkness is falling. So it's hard enough as it is.
Yeah.
And then if you're in this tiny, tiny church of ours, where the largest congregations boast maybe 40 odd on a Sunday, that's the big one. So we're mid-sized with 20 odd. And there's some of them are less than 10 week after week, but refuse to close because they want to be, they don't want to go away. It does require, it's genuinely difficult. It's life limiting in a secular sense, or can be, because you shut down opportunities. And part of my job as a pastor is to make it worth people's while.
Yeah. Well, there's three things that kind of strike me from what you've shared there. The first is the sacrifice that those bakers were willing to make. That shows the priority of we value this confession, this church, and we are willing to really that's a large sacrifice to allow this ministry to occur, and also that it's those lay people who valued the confession, the Lutheran teachings, Lutheran practices, that brought brought Lutheranism to England, really. It's kind of similar to in the United States. You were sharing what happened, what the situation is in Finland. The LCMS was on that same path, and it was the lay people who stood up and really saved the LCMS from going down a very, very dark path.
Yeah, and that's a good Lutheran way, isn't it? And the Augsburg Confession is signed by lay people only, and it's writing by this kind of, this is our confession.
I love that.
I mean, we are in England is the oldest mission of the Missouri Synod, overseas mission of the followed closely a couple of years behind us is India, but nobody sent missionaries here.
It's
very much a man of Macedonia come to us also.
That's I love that. I love that.
But can I just tell you the story of my congregation, because I think that's very instructive. I know. Because we are one of the later missions who was founded in 1971, and they did this thing. Money came from the States. They built a church, called a pastor, and said, "Right now, let's try and fill that church." So the first congregation was the pastor, his wife, and their children, and they started. And he was a very gifted Canadian man called Bob Brewer, and he was very, very gifted missionary, and clearly people still talk to me. Pastor Brewer used to say, and he left in 1981. He's really, really important. But he came here and did some excellent work. Church grew from nothing to probably about 60, 70 members in a decade, which in this country is remarkable. Then he moved on, took another call, and eventually returned to Canada. And gradually things began to change. And first the growth plateaued, and then it began to reverse. So that when my predecessor left, took a call in 2001, the next Sunday there were, I think, 12 or 13 in church, and that was it. The first thing I did was sell the church to a house builder who demolished it, and now their houses on there because he was eating up all their money, leaking roof and that kind of business. And the central, the kind of executive council of the church said, you don't have a future. If I paraphrase, we will support you in any way you need spiritually, but they recommended closing the place down, and they said, no, we're not going anywhere. And they were vacant for 9 years.
Wow. And
the same sort of 13, 14 people. And eventually they just saved money. The proceeds of the sale of the church they didn't keep, they gave it back to the church, saying, we don't need it, you need it. And then eventually they said, they asked if they could have a vicar just to look after them, with a possible view to calling him if the church would help. So that's when I came into the picture. I was sent here in 2009 as a vicar.
Wow. And
about a couple of months into my vicarage, they held a meeting where they said they would like to call me if the central church will financially support them. So we were given £60,000, which was enough money with their giving for 3 years.
Wow.
So they absolutely categorically refused to go away.
I love that.
Advice. And I said to my wife that if this thing goes for 10 years, that will be a miracle. And I said that was 2010 that I the call. And our church has grown about, I don't know, 120, 130%. But when you start with very small numbers, you still, we're still under 40 as members. And they somehow managed to pay me a full past salary. So there's you come here and you don't see any heroes. There's nothing kind of particularly profound going on, and but there's this really.
But the Lord is at work.
Faithfulness and the refusal to go away. And refusals, because there are plenty of churches in this town. There are lots of churches to go to. So no, this is our church, and it's been a real gift for me to learn from them and to learn to teach them also to value even more deeply, not just this their church, but this is a Lutheran church for a reason, that we need this confession of the Christian faith, and not just.
Reminds me of the church in Revelation. Now, though you are small, you are little in power, right? But they're faithful. That's amazing. Amazing.
I went to college as an undergraduate, which is quite small and not as famous as some other colleges. But I was there for an event recently, and the master college says, we're not a grand college, oh, we are a great college. That describes my congregation. We are not a grand congregation, but we are a great congregation. Really.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
The second thing that stuck out to me is the idea that they understood Lutheranism for all people. And I think that is profoundly important, that it not be looked at as a religion that is, German or Finnish or American. It is a confession that is for all people. And in fact, as you know, in Africa, there are more Lutherans than there are elsewhere. So we have this idea that the Lutheran confessions, our belief, our confession of faith, the way we worship, the way we understand Scripture, it's not rooted in the ethnic identity, but it's rooted in truth and in Scripture, and we want that to be for all people. And seeing that attitude, that's a wonderful reflection. The last thing that I was thinking about with that, let's see if I can come back to it. Remember what I was thinking. Well, now it escapes me. So maybe it'll come back to me in a little bit here.
That's all right.
But that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
I
just say that we've got quite a few of our members are newer members. Most of the new people who've joined us, not all of them. I've done, we have baptisms and so on, but a lot of people come from other denominations to Lutheranism in this country. Yeah. When I say a lot, we haven't got a lot of anything.
A lot in relative terms.
Proportion, good proportion. And very often people are on a very similar journey where there's at some point they have been part of a charismatic tradition and maybe a reformed tradition.
Yeah.
And they almost universally, the feeling is that people kind of come and it's like that feeling when you come home from a long day's work and you sit in your favorite chair and just go, we can rest now, relax. That there's this, our confessions is this beautiful, beautiful way of both giving, first of all, giving every human and every kind of human life, every kind of calling, a tremendous dignity, doctrine of vocation and creation and vocation. But also that the knowledge of the grace of God is incredibly, it's not cheap at all. It's very, very costly, but it's free at the point of use. It comes to us free. It's being paid up front, which then frees us to this life of uncomplicated service.
Yeah. Yeah.
The kind of like Martin Luther talked about in Large Catechism, if you're a cobbler, make good shoes.
Right.
That's good work. And it takes away this pressure that exists,
You don't have to be impressive.
Yeah, impressive. And somehow, how can it be more God-pleasing my life? Yeah. Is there another program I can sign up to or another meeting I can go to, or should I be evangelizing more on this? And instead of saying, actually, no, you can just rest, to use a good pietist phrase from Finland, you rest in the wounds of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then look around and say, well, so what? What does this mean? This kind of baptismal confidence, this is like in this country, when you go to school, children wear school uniform. And I used to teach in a school where they had this very simple rule: if you're wearing a uniform, you are our business. So if you're smoking in town on a Saturday afternoon, wearing school uniform, we will put you in detention after school on Monday because you were wearing a uniform. And it's that kind of thing. Baptism is like I'm wearing this baptismal garment. It means that I'm completely beloved. I'm completely loved.
Yeah.
And I have lots to do, but it all comes as a child learning from the father and wishing to please a father rather than an apprentice trying to get a job.
Yeah. And you're not having to earn anything. It's already established. You're just living out who you are, who Christ has made you to be. Yeah.
And I find that when people come from other Christian traditions and they come and hear this, they're very often they're actually like, at last. There's a whole bunch of evangelical clergy in this country that I've corresponded with on and off, who are kind of say, we just love Lutheranism. They haven't made the leap, but we just love Lutheranism because it's got that freedom.
Well, in the sacraments being something that you're receiving, right? You come and here's the Lord's Supper, and it is a gift. It is entirely Christ for you. and you're just coming empty-handed.
Yeah.
And it's so beautiful to understand that's the whole idea.
Yeah. It's like that line in the Psalms, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. Yeah, that's it. This is basically Christian spirituality in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah. I did finally come back to remembering what my third point was here. And that is the encouragement that I think is necessary. And that's one of the things I really love about being able to interact on Twitter, because I wouldn't have any idea that you exist or that anything about those congregations. But I think it's important. It's helpful for us to understand the larger Lutheran world, so that those who are in really difficult situations can understand I'm part of something bigger. And I have these other brothers and sisters in Christ who are there supporting me, praying for me, wanting the best for me. And for those who are in those more challenging situations, to be a witness to those who might be in a little easier situation, which sometimes leads to complacency.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And we are in, financially speaking, we are in dire straits and have been all along, and will continue to be, and that's a real stress on for our pastors and our congregations. But in many ways, our life is also very comfortable and easy, and we have this freedom. We had, as a visitor to our church many years ago, somebody that my father first met in Kenya, a Somali man who had converted from Islam to Christianity. I'll tell you another time about, he's suffered tremendously, very personal losses, physical violence, bereavements as a result of that. And he said, his name is Mohammed Gurhan. He said, I don't expect to die a natural death, but before I die, I want as many Somalis as possible to hear the gospel. And he founded the Somali Lutheran Church in Ethiopia, which there's one of the federal states of Ethiopia is ethnically Somali, and he works there, and he's a remarkable man. He studied for a while in England, and he came and visited our church. And I got him to stand up and tell my congregation his story.
Yeah.
And, this is a man. So when the Catholic Archbishop of Mogadishu was gunned down, his blood splattered on Muhammad's face because he was that close. His sister and brother-in-law had been murdered. Some of his children had been kidnapped. He's had his own teeth knocked out with a stone. His son has permanently brain damage because of attacks by Islamic mob. This is the man. He comes here, speaks very quietly, very sort of unexpressively almost. Just said, this is my story, and I want everyone to know, and I just want Somalis to hear the gospel.
Wow.
And it's a tremendous encouragement. We think we have it hard because we're not sure whether we can make budget this year. And to hear and to see that kind of quiet confidence.
Wow, I love that. That. Well,
I think you're right.
I'll tell you what, we are closing in on kind of the time that I need to let you go to attend to your pastoral duties. But there's a lot more I'd love to cover at some point. Can we have you back and maybe be able to discuss more of some of your father's work? I would love to hear about what he did with the Book of Concord, your love of the Bach cantatas and what you put together with that. I think that's fantastic. And I get to make use of that from time to time on Lutheran Radio UK here.
Very good. Yes.
Yeah. But I do appreciate you giving your time, sharing more about what's going on in Finland, in England, your story. Is there anything you want to share with folks before we close up for today?
Well, first of all, I'd love to carry on our conversation. It feels like I'm a talkative man, and it feels like we've only just got started. So, so any opportunity to talk more?
I think we could fill a day easily.
Maybe that day will come one day. Who knows? But there is a lot to tell. A lot more. I think that is important to share. I suppose the overriding thing. I mean, this is something I did learn from my father. He was a far, in every way, greater man than I. Physically and then as a theologian and so on. But the thing that was his sort of overriding the overriding force in his life, which he had inherited from previous generations, and in a way, many ways, and inculcated in us, is the love of the Lutheran confessions, which is say that all. When you think why do we have all these different denominations? What does it matter? And so, well, if anybody who confesses the Nicene Creed and the Athanasian Creed and the Apostles' Creed, well, that's Christianity. You're a Christian. But and all Christians agree God is triune, that Jesus is God and man, and he's died for the sins of the world, and he rose from the dead to give us, etc. The Pope in Rome believes that, and the guys at the Assemblies of God believe that, and everything else in between. So what does it matter? The denominations differ, and where it's so important that we hold on to our confession is how we get our piece of that salvation. I'm absolutely convinced of it, that what distinguishes Catholics from Lutherans, from Anglicans, from Reformed, from Pentecostals is the answer to the question, okay, this is what God has done, how do I get mine? And you can give misleading answers to that and still have Jesus.
Yeah.
But the moment you have once you have misleading, it's like once you have something misleading in there, it's like misdirection by Satan. He's like a good magician has lots of misdirection and manages to trick you. Well, that's exactly how Satan works. And heterodoxy, or kind of imperfect confession, incomplete confession of the biblical truths, is almost more dangerous than heresy, because heresy kind of just looks like they're wrong.
Yeah.
And
He's
so
more easily identifiable.
Yeah. It's like, it's got lights on it and it's got smoke coming out of under the curtain. It's okay, that doesn't look good. And so, and when you're in an American setting where you've got a religion for, in different religion for every man on the street.
Right.
And Lutheranism is as diverse as it can be. Or if you're in somewhere like Finland or Sweden, where kind of this a radical liberalism has completely taken over and won over the church, or if you're somewhere like in England where nobody's even noticed, there are thousands of people in my town who don't know we exist, even though we're a small town of about 60,000 people. Whatever you're setting, if you're in Africa, is that the once we find the truth, we must, it's necessary, we must go say with Peter, you have the words of eternal life. To whom shall we go, Lord? You have the words of eternal life. And however insignificant the worldly effects are, and however much bigger everything else is, for us to have that clean conscience and the opportunity to bear witness to the truth with as little misdirection as possible, is a tremendous responsibility. It's a tremendous privilege. And we're not in the kingdom of God, and it's easy to say in this morning, I can say this really confidently in this tiny church. In the kingdom of God, we are not in the strategy department. We're not generals, we're not colonels even. We're very much foot soldiers, and if you get to wear one of these, it means that you're a corporal, right? Or maybe a sergeant if you get to wear a bishop's mitre. But we have been called to be faithful and diligent, and then to trust that if God wants to shut down the ELCE this generation, fine, as long as it didn't shut down because I was negligent.
Yeah.
And the ship goes down, I'll go down with it. But this, and just be confident that God stands behind his word.
Yeah.
If I can finish with the final anecdote, then I'll stop talking. Is I mentioned earlier Bishop Risto Soramies, who's the first bishop of the mission diocese in Finland. Before that, he was a missionary to Turks, first in Germany and then in Istanbul for decades.
Wow.
He only really came to live in Finland when he retired. And he was the founding pastor of the Lutheran Church of Istanbul. And I was once in a meeting where he was with a lot of pastors from all over the place there, and people were complaining about how hard it is and why can't we get the church to grow? And he kind of sat there for a while and then says, folks, I am the de facto Lutheran bishop of Istanbul, with a population of 10 million, and of whom fewer than 1% are Christian. Wow. And this, folks, is Constantinople, the capital of Christendom.
Yeah.
And God moved his lampstand. And when he does that, there's nothing you can do about it. Just stand firm. And whatever the generals do, the generals do. You just keep shooting the direction they point. And I think that's a real that gives us the confidence and humility all in one dose. So that would be kind of my message for today.
Excellent. All right. Well, Pastor Simojoki, we really do appreciate your time today. Blessings to you and to the saints in your congregation and the brothers and sisters in Christ in the ELCE. What a blessing to be in that same confession, in the same faith, able to pray for, encourage, and support one another.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to carrying on another time, God willing.
Very good. Thank you.